Hey, connected yoga teachers. Before we get into today's episode, I want to take a moment to address the United States Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade on June 24th, 2022, which stripped away the right to have a safe and legal abortion. Restricting access to comprehensive reproductive care, including abortion, threatens the health and independence of all American people. This decision could also lead to the loss of other rights. To learn more about what you can do to help, go to podvoices.help. I encourage you to speak up, take care, and spread the word. Also, we'll put a link to podvoices.help in the show notes, which is over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/282. Today's episode has been brought to you by OfferingTree. If you don't know OfferingTree yet, they are an amazing company that is listening to what yoga teachers need, and they are taking that information and creating the best all-in-one software that I know of for wellness professionals. If you are wanting a simple and professional online presence, they will help you with your schedule. They will help you as you book classes, take payments, host online videos and resources with your Zoom integration, email, and much more. Go to offeringtree.com/Shannon for a special discount for our podcast listeners. That's offeringtree.com/Shannon. Today's episode is also brought to you by the Accessible Yoga Continuing Education Program. This is really exciting, connected yoga teachers. If you're not already subscribed to the Accessible Yoga podcast, make sure to do that. And then check out all of the continuing education programs that they have. So they choose a theme each and every month. This month is pelvic health and yoga. And I'm excited that I got to be part of a podcast interview, and some of our members of pelvic health professionals are highlighted as guest experts in the programs that the Accessible Yoga team has put together this month. And then going forward, August, they're going to talk about environmental justice and yoga. September is cancer and yoga. In October is the Accessible Yoga Conference. Make sure to check that out. November, they're doing yoga for veterans. And then to wrap up the year in December, they're doing addiction recovery and yoga. So there is tons over there for you to check out. Tons of resources, blog articles, videos, podcasts, all kinds of things to continue learning as you go. And they are topics that I think are really, with what's happening right now and what will serve our yoga students. So I'll make sure to put a link to that in our show notes. And you can find everything over at accessibleyoga.org. So check it out, accessibleyoga.org, and I'll see you over there because I'm over there learning as well. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. If you're new here, I'm your host, Shannon Crow. I use she, her pronouns. And right now I'm recording on Anishinaabeg, Ottawa, and Mississauga land, which was also named the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, Canada, when it was settled. I want to give a shout out this week to my dad, who turns 70 this week. Gosh, I love my dad so much. He doesn't listen to the podcast. He's not a yoga teacher, but I wish all of you could meet him and get to know him. So I'll tell you a little bit about him so I can kind of paint a picture. He's a cowboy in Alberta. He rides horses out there, drives a combine for most of the summer, and then he flies home to make maple syrup. He taught me to work hard and play harder. He never told my brother and I what we should do in terms of work. He's just super proud of us for who we are, and I think that's really a gift in terms of parenting, and I try to really do the same for my kids. And I think I can thank my dad for loving storytelling, listening to stories and telling stories. And in those stories, how details can get fuzzy and stories change over time. And sometimes they'll like stop a story and say, wait a second, I don't think it was on a Wednesday. I think it was on a Thursday. If that ever happens when my dad is telling a story, he'll just kind of wink and say, never let the truth get in the way of a good story, and then laugh it off. And so in those moments, I will also say that to him. And I say it to my kids as well when they correct me and they're like, no, that's not how it happened. So feel free to use that if it helps you. My dad also taught me to speak up for people. And really, I have to say, over the years, he's become a little more conservative, which I think here in Canada means something different than in the US, our US neighbors. But I love that while we were chatting the other day, I just asked him flat out his thoughts on what's been going on in the US since the overturn of Roe versus Wade. And he just very, very strongly said, it's up to women to decide what they want to do. And I reminded him gently, because we have these discussions a lot, that it is also that men and non-binary folks can also get pregnant. And he was like, right. Yeah, well, whatever. It's up to those people. It's not up to anyone else. And so I really appreciate that. As much as sometimes I think, gosh, Dad is really leaning over towards the conservative side of things, he feels very strongly about human rights. So that's a little bit about my dad, and I hope he has just the best birthday week ever. And I'm looking forward to seeing him in the fall when we cut up all the wood getting ready for maple syrup season. And if you're a new listener here, you might not know that I'm also a mom of 3, a yoga teacher, podcaster, and founder of Pelvic Health Professionals. And this podcast was created for you so that each and every week you are connected to the information, the inspiration, and the support that you need as you build your yoga business, because there can be some really tough days as a yoga teacher, as a small business owner. And something is leading me this week to just call attention to, if you are having a tough week, you are not alone. I've been talking with a lot of yoga teachers and a lot of entrepreneur friends who are feeling like there's a lot happening in the world, and maybe they're also dealing with things in their personal life, and you might be in the same boat. And I just want to remind you in those really tough weeks, like, what can you do to step back, take a rest? One thing that I did over the last few weeks is I really took a step back from social media. I was like, I actually can't be on here as much as I was. I still want to stay informed with what's happening in the world, but I just needed to be outside more. I knew that. So maybe, I don't know if that helps in any way. And also, this podcast is here for you if you feel like you just want to focus in on the work and get ready to really think about your yoga business. Sometimes it helps me to really focus in and think, what am I doing in terms of my day, my work? So I think this episode today is one of those that is really motivating when you're, needing that inspiration of some teaching ideas, or looking at your classes and adding a little more to them, or seeing, hey, what's missing in my yoga class? And I guess I have a question around that. Have you ever been to a yoga class where you thought, something is missing in this class? Or have you ever thought, why didn't this teacher do this thing or say this cue? Or why didn't they include this element in their yoga class? And I think that sometimes when we leave yoga teacher training, or when we've been teaching for a really long time, it's worth looking at, what makes a well-rounded yoga class? And I was really excited and intrigued when Kathryn Anne Flynn first shared this idea with me, which is why I invited her here to the podcast to talk about this, to talk about what is missing from a yoga class. And I love that it got into how we can make yoga more accessible as well. I think that's a really important conversation. If you don't know Kathryn yet, Kathryn Anne Flynn is a teacher and student of yoga, meditation, Ayurveda, and psychotherapy in Ottawa, Canada. And she's known for weaving together her fields of study and practice tools to meet life with a compassionate presence. Students of many generations now call her their teacher, and they're drawn to how she makes yoga inclusive and authentic. I first heard of Kathryn on her podcast, actually, which is called Intelligent Edge Yoga Podcast. But she also has a book. She has online practices. She has trainings, workshops, retreats, lots of offerings out there. And she's been in the yoga world and particularly the yoga teacher training world for a long time. She shares her insights today about some key elements that she sees that are missing, especially with newer teachers. She talks about how silence is important. And I love how this ties in with last week's podcast episode as well, where we talked about the importance of silence. Go back and have a listen if you haven't already to episode 281. Kathryn also talked about joint care and little joint care, like the little joints in your body. We also got into a really good discussion around music and playlists because this is something that I see being a real topic, especially in that first yoga teacher training. And Kathryn gave us tips on how we can create a better environment for our yoga students. So I cannot wait until you have a listen to this. So whether you're a brand new teacher, you're in yoga teacher training, or if you've been teaching for a while, this is one of those episodes that I think you can have a listen to and, get inspired to see, maybe I'll add that thing back to my yoga classes. Or, oh yeah, I kind of forgot about that thing. Oh, connected yoga teachers, before we get into this conversation with Kathryn today, I want to let you know that there is a draw for one of her books, and you can enter to win just by commenting in the show notes. So if you head over to theconnectedyogateacher.com/282, as you're listening to the episode, maybe you have a question or a thought, or you want to share something that comes up for you as you're listening to today's episode, then you're automatically entered to win one of Kathryn's books. We'll do the draw by Friday, so make sure to leave a comment there. And I'll share more later on in today's episode near the end of that. All right, so I just wanted to let you know that so that you can enter the draw. So let's dive in and hear from Kathryn. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. Kathryn, it's so great to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited that we get to dive in and talk about what might be missing from your yoga class if you're a yoga teacher, which our listeners all are. But before we do that, can you tell our listeners, if they don't know you yet, what is the work that you do and who do you do it for?
Ooh, great question. And I like the introduction to the person and the context. I am a yoga educator. I'm in Ottawa, Canada. And I say yoga educator to convey that I mostly run yoga trainings and silent retreats. And I teach teachers. And at this point, I'm actually not even teaching many, if any at all, yoga classes. I mostly devote my time to my 300-hour program and to offering what I call supportive silent retreats. So I'm all about introducing people to the potency of gentleness and being gentle with themselves, even when I'm teaching peppier things, because everyone still loves vinyasa. And then I'm also finishing my education in Master's of Counseling Psychology. So I am a fledgling psychotherapist, and I specialize in attachment and trauma therapy for children, adolescents, and adults. And I help families, sometimes who have been adopted and sometimes who just have otherwise difficult histories, work through their stuff.
What got you interested in this work from the work of being a yoga teacher and teaching yoga teachers?
Yeah, I I love understanding why. Because I'm not a rules person. I'm not a rulesy person. Even though I wrote a book that has a number of principles to apply, I'm much more interested in exploring both depth and breadth because I find the closer you get to someone or something, be it a piece of information or a practice, the less you cling to rigid ideas about that person or thing, you relax into it. So, new teachers, they cling to their plan, and that's a perfectly normal response to feeling nervous, to wanting to do a good job. But as they relax into the practice of teaching, they're more open to adjusting their plan. And when it comes to trauma and attachment, so much of why people are, kids included, are suffering, it's because it's a very logical, when you think of the nervous system, it's a very logical reaction. Even though it appears illogical, the behavior appears illogical, it's actually really logical reaction to what happened to them. And so when you start to get closer to someone and you really understand their story and you help them understand, why their brain reacted the way it did, they can start to relax because they don't think that there's anything wrong with them anymore. They actually see that their brain was seeking self-protective behavior. So for me, it's all a continuum of getting closer.
This is really amazing. And I'm thinking of a yoga teacher psychotherapist here in our area, Diane Liska. We've had her on the podcast, and I just feel like you two would have a lot in common. I'm glad that you mentioned your book. It's called Teach Kind, Clear Yoga. And I feel like this is a beautiful book if you want to know a lot about yoga that maybe isn't covered in a 200 or 300 hour yoga teacher training, especially a 200 hour. You tell me, what was your motivation for writing the book, and what have you heard in terms of feedback?
Oh, that's lovely. I've heard that I've had feedback that it feels like a teacher training in a book, or at least what a teacher training, hopefully should be in the modern era. And I've heard that it explores a number of topics in the right amount of depth. Um, considering the scope of topics that I cover. I wrote it from a place of sincerely believing that most people approach the practice of teaching yoga with wonderful intentions and really wanting to be of service. This is a book for teachers who want to be of service. And so it takes a positive approach. I try to teach from a place of grounded information, that being an equal appreciation for evidence-based practice, but also concepts that are perhaps, maybe they elude science, but they have a rich history behind them. And so I really wanted to tackle an approach that felt kind, hence the title, both in the study of yoga and then in the offering of yoga. So that's what I set out to do. And I'm happy with it. Every once in a while, I'll flip it open and I'll be like, oh yeah, that's that's a good bit. I can't believe I wrote that.
That's a great way to summarize your book. I love how you said that there's a lot in there. And I feel like many of those topics, you could write a whole book on them, but you cover so many in a way that it's like bite-sized pieces of information for yoga teachers that are sometimes missed. So speaking of what's missed or missing, I'm excited that that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, I know that you have led lots of yoga teacher trainings. What do you think is missing in those first yoga classes when yoga teachers start to step out into the world?
Yeah. So let me back it up for a moment. I have led a number of, I call them foundational yoga teacher trainings, which means I reviewed hundreds, maybe approaching 1,000 of practice teaches. Because in my program, we do the practice teach a few times. So we do it initially in a round robin style, and then a 15-minute, and then they do a longer one toward the end. And I really like to do it that way because I think initially folks just need to realize that they can stand up in front of a group of people and lead them in some movement, meditation, and breathing practices, and it's going to be okay. I think that there's sort of a ripping the Band-Aid kind of process that needs to happen. They just need to realize that it is possible. And then the next time around, they will settle down in their nervous system enough to, potentially remember their sequence and the whole process. So I've seen a lot of practice teachers, and what we do is by the end of everyone's practice teach, I've taken group notes because there's always trends. And sometimes that's the flavor of a particular group. I tend to attract a fairly diverse range of age and mobility, but sometimes there's a particular flavor to a group. So you'll see trends within a training, but across so many trainings, I've seen a number of trends. And so I thought that's what I would share with your audience.
I'm also really glad that you addressed how sometimes terrifying it is to get up and teach when you're in that yoga teacher training. I know that being part of different yoga teacher trainings, it's that moment where you're like, okay, you're going to teach this breath practice to your partner, or you're going to teach the small movement to two other people. There's this moment and this look of panic on a lot of people's faces. Like, there's the love of yoga. I want to learn more about yoga. I want to practice yoga more. And then the teaching part. So thank you for really highlighting that that's an important part of a yoga teacher training, is to practice that skill.
100%. And teaching yoga is never going to be as hard as it is in your training. For your listeners who are perhaps still in their training or are going to do more training, it's never as hard because you don't have a person sitting in your classroom with a clipboard taking notes. It's such a vulnerable thing. And I don't know that this is always happening at a conscious level, but it's such a vulnerable thing to even work up the courage to do that and simultaneously be reviewed on that content. But in both teaching yoga and psychotherapy, I've had a lot of opportunities to record my teaching and receive feedback on that. And that process can take a while to settle into, and it will always strike, I think, at your vulnerability. But eventually you'll realize that there is enough benefit that it's okay. You can take the risk because no one's going to take away the opportunity for you to teach. No, you're not going to lose anything. You really only stand to gain. So reviewing your teaching it can remain uncomfortable, and it's worth it.
Oh, I love this. I especially love, for people who are in their yoga teacher training right now, just to bring that back. It's never going to be as hard as it is right then in your yoga teacher training. Oh my gosh, that's a great thing to remind ourselves. So let's get into the missing elements. What do you see are these trends or these patterns, the things that are missing?
So the first one, I'm going to put this on the table as something that is missing in even the classes of experienced teachers. So this begins in training, and it's silence. We all know that talking too much or talking not at all can both be signs of anxiety. However, if you're leading a yoga class, it's expected that you're going to be doing some talking, and nerves tend to carry us through so many shares. And maybe it's because it occurs to us that there's this other piece of information, or, oh, yeah, there's this other great alignment cue. And you said it this way on the first side, so you need to say it on the second side. And it's something I try to convey in the book, and it's something I try to convey in my trainings, is that if you design your classes in a way that folks are safe, like relatively safe doing the practice, you can have faith in the resilience of the human body, which means you can have faith in the potency of silence and restrain yourself to offer more space, because people need silence so badly if their lives are super busy and loud. I'm mostly talking about parents.
I love it. Silence is so good. And I understand the difficulty as the teacher to just leave the silence there, as a human being walking the planet, as a podcaster, as a parent. Yeah, I love that you shared this.
Yeah. So silence is a big one. Another one is little joint care. So by that, I mean smaller joints like your fingers, your hands, your wrists, your toes, your feet, your ankles. We don't often think about the need to strengthen and mobilize these joints until we've lost the ability to move them. And so, if someone moseys into your class and they have a wrist injury, then you're going to be thinking about how much downward dog can you include in this class. But I think maybe because there's not a lot of stretch response, right? There's not a lot of feeling of strengthening or stretching to some of these smaller activities. We don't think that they're doing good work, but I include wrist and ankle rolls, usually done from the back with hands and feet in the air, and shoulder circles in pretty much all of my classes, because they will maintain joints. But if you're talking about, head, neck, and shoulder circles, they'll also reduce neck and shoulder tension with less chance of injury than a lot of neck stretching will. So little joint care is my other one.
Oh, that's a good one, because often people come to a yoga class thinking, okay, let's go. Let's get into those hamstrings. You're right. There is a lot more emphasis on the bigger areas in our body, and these ones are super important. And as you were saying this, I was literally thinking, okay, wrists. I was like moving here. So we can all do that as we listen to the podcast here now.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. They're things that could easily be chair yoga, but I mentioned that I like to teach a lot of time on the back, and I'll talk about that in a second, but my classes almost always open reclined. And so if you reach your hands and your feet to the ceiling and you can do some wrist and ankle rolls there, that's also a little bit of a core warm up, right? You're starting to talk to some of those supportive muscles of the trunk and getting them firing, but in a very gentle, accessible way. So I like efficiency. I like doing the most good with the amount of time that I have. So I'm also, actually, this is another thing. And I say this in the book: dare to be simple, dare to be repetitive. There are so many practitioners out there who are into set sequences. Set sequences is a significant part of yoga asanas history. So there are people who build entire lifetimes of practice around doing the same thing over and over again. And so simplicity, reduces the complexity for the new teacher, which means that they can hopefully settle into the teacher's seat, be calm. It gives people the opportunity to hone skill at something. It allows you to get into that rhythm right? That sort of energetic flow rhythm where without having to constantly think about what's coming next, the constant communication between teacher and student of what's coming next. And it's okay. You're not there to entertain people, right? They are there for body mind care. They have Netflix for entertainment.
Thank goodness. They have Netflix for entertainment is so good. I once did an 11-week series where I used the same sequence the whole 11 weeks, and I loved it. My students who were taking the class loved it, and I just changed out 2 poses to go sort of more in line with the theme that we were talking about. And I doubt anyone taking the class even knew that we were doing the same sequence for 11 weeks.
Oh, you didn't tell them?
I did not tell them.
Okay.
I do have a hard time. I have a hard time sticking to the same thing when I see things happening in the room. So for sure, it would be a different experience as well in the 11 weeks. So yeah, I did not.
Exactly. I mean, that's a long period of time. The seasons change. The people in the room might change a little bit. But, again, I talk about this in the book. There is so much that we teach in yoga now that is not classical yoga asana. So we need to be really skillful in describing movement, which is an incredibly challenging thing to do. You're taking a symbolic system and trying to convey kinesthetic movement. Like they are radically different beasts. And yet we try our best because we are trying to, help and support our students through accurate supportive cueing. However, if you teach the same nameless, odd mobility exercise time and time again, your students will gain familiarity with it. And then the more familiar they are, the less you need to talk because they're honing their own intuition and expertise.
Right. Oh my gosh, this is great. I love how this dare to be simple and repetitive, really ties in with the silence. It allows us to have more time for silence, and that they both simplify teaching. Like we can talk less, we don't have to fill the space, and we can repeat the sequence that we've created. We don't have to keep drawing out new class plans all the time. These are fantastic.
Exactly. And if you are really nervous when you teach, teaching yoga is incredibly different than practicing yoga, as every yoga teacher trainee now knows, right? It's a very different experience. And so, it can feel like we're being awkward. Students don't know that. They're breathing, they're trying to set down their worries and fill their buckets. They're not really worrying about us. And if you're super nervous, goodness, the internet has never provided more fabulous music, whether you're looking for gentle waves and chimes or, whatever the latest Lapsley song is or East Forest, right? There's so much music out there that can be supportive and create atmosphere so that you can allow your students to do the practice and enjoy the music and know that that's a really potent experience.
I'm popping in here, Connected Yoga Teachers, because I wanted to share a bit of a conversation that I recently had with Sara Villamil, who is a yoga teacher from Calgary, Alberta, who uses OfferingTree. I really think it's great when we can hear from people who are using the software that I keep talking about rather than me just talking about it. So here's part of that conversation with Sara. If there's something that you could say to the OfferingTree team, what would you like to say to them?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for all the support, especially over this really challenging time when we're trying to figure out things that are definitely beyond our portfolio and our scope, for making life easy, for being so kind and friendly in your communication, for never really seeming in any way like any question is silly or out of bounds, just being so helpful. I just wanted to say thank you so much for designing this exact offering because it is so perfect for a yoga teacher, a Pilates teacher, a movement teacher, a meditation teacher. It is exactly what we need.
If our connected yoga teachers want to take a class with you, how do they find that?
So my website is saravillamil.com. So www.saravillamil.com. You can connect with me on Instagram at saravillamil_yoga and just send me a direct message. I'd love to invite anyone who wants to try a free class, that their first class could be free through the Connected Yoga podcast. And I invite anyone to join that would like to join or ask me any questions about my experience with OfferingTree and running a membership and using this website.
Thank you, Sara. And also thank you, Team OfferingTree, for bringing the podcast to our listeners and also for creating this great software. Sara and Team OfferingTree, you are doing amazing things in this world. Thank you so much for bringing yoga to people. Now let's dive back into our chat with Kathryn so we can learn about how to really improve our yoga classes. Okay, speaking of music, before you and I hit record today, I said to you, well, from being in so many 200-hour yoga teacher trainings and seeing that practice teach and seeing people, I used to be one of the people where students would come and bounce ideas off of me one-on-one before their practice teach. And 100% of the time, well, I don't want to say 100% of the time, but most people there were all asking me how to make a playlist, what songs to include on their playlist, what they would be playing their music on. There was such a focus on that aspect of a practice teach, which really blew me away because I think you can teach a class without any music. I love that you're saying it can support us. What are your thoughts on why we do this as yoga teachers, put so much focus on the music?
Yeah. I mean, music is so subjective. And I did an entire podcast on music playlists in yoga classes. So I'm sort of reaching back to some of that information. Music is so subjective, but I keep using the word potent because it can be potent in its transformative capacity, but it also can be, it can have the exact opposite effect, right? It can alienate someone from the practice. And part of that is because when we hear music, we recognize and that's the important part. We respond to it with the same hormones, the same hormonal neurotransmitter reaction as we do to someone we love. Which is why when your jam comes on, you're filled with this motivational energy, and why you take it so personally when someone doesn't like your favorite musician. It feels like a criticism of something that you really love. And so when teachers put together these playlists, that is music that is perhaps harder to ignore, right? It's more extroverted. It's got lyrics. It's a particular style. The people who like that music are going to have a really great time in class. And the people who don't like that music are going to be, it's going to be more challenging for them to downregulate, to drop into that relaxation response, which we hope is the ultimate outcome of our yoga classes. But I'm with you. I think it's important to be able to teach and practice both with and without. It's just another tool that you need to know how and when to apply it.
I love that you shared this, that it really depends on our taste in music. That's so good. I was just thinking of the music that I would not appreciate in a yoga class. And I love how you explained why our brain works this way. I did not know that. Uh, what
Yeah.
other things do you think are missing from some yoga classes?
Actually, before I go back to that, I'll just tell you the shortest, cutest story, because I find I'm with you. Teacher trainees often want to teach with a playlist because they've had such great experiences listening to music they love and practicing yoga. And yoga has like a rhythmic dance element to it. It's got that sensual movement that can pair so beautifully with music. And so I had this one teacher trainee. She was so young, I think maybe 20. And she was a runner. So she did a practice teach that was yoga for runners. But it was pretty peppy. And the opening was, I think it was like a folk song. And you were like, okay, it's kind of loud off the bat. And then during her core work standing sequence, lots of planks, side planks, and lunges. It was to this really beautiful Shavasana track. And then as we were in Shavasana, it was hip hop. and, and so as we were doing feedback, I mentioned, the playlist was interesting. You may want to consider matching your playlist to your sequence and thinking about how it's going to roll out. And she laughed and she said, "Oh, yeah, my playlist was on shuffle." And I was just so nervous, I didn't go fix it.
This makes me laugh so much. I have had some really interesting things happen with a playlist. The story that always sticks in my mind is I was teaching a prenatal yoga class and the stereo was at the back, and I just had really, very soothing music, mostly no lyrics. And I have no idea what happened this day. But this random song that's just on like my personal playlist, which is like a really aggressive breakup song with swearing, came on. And thank goodness my prenatal students, by the time I was starting to walk towards the back, they were like, no, leave it. We like this song. I was mortified. And at the end of their series, they had asked if they could all have a copy of my playlist to take with them for birthing, which was so sweet. And they're like, please put that song in there.
That is hilarious. And I feel like that's a whole other podcast, is talking about grief and anger and sort of allowable versus push down emotions around maternity and infancy,
Yes.
postpartum. Like, oh my goodness.
It is. I'll make sure also to grab that link to the podcast where you're talking more about music and playlists, because that's a great podcast to link to. We haven't talked about that a lot on our podcast. Okay, so
cool.
Yeah, we can link to that. What else would you say, okay, this piece might be missing, or consider this for your yoga classes?
Yeah. Okay. So I have, one's a sequencing piece, and then two are actually specific. It's sequencing still, but specific postures. So I'll start with the sequencing. So because when I talk about accessible yoga, I wrote the book with this intention, and I say this up front in the introduction. I'm talking about making mat classes more accessible. So that assumes that someone can get down onto a yoga mat and get back up. So standing up and sitting down on the ground is a reasonable thing to do. I think that there are increasing resources out there on chair yoga and adaptive yoga. But I wanted to somewhat narrow my focus. So what we're talking about today, that's my vision. Even though if someone came to my class and we needed to unfold a chair for them to participate, I think that's, if you have a spacious class, there's no problem with accommodating folks, right? Because when you've got space, you have calm, you have resource to be able to work a little bit more with individuals. So, but let's assume people can get down on the ground. Teachers, this is both trainees and a lot of teachers, I think, do not realize how valuable being on the ground is. I work with a wonderful man named Dr. Jeff Outerbridge, who was the clinical director of World Spine Care for 10 years. And I quote Jeff in the book, and Jeff did one of the science reviews of my book. And he's a fabulous human being who knows a lot about spines and movement and what is safe and what is healthy and normal across the lifespan. And Jeff really feels that if you have someone who is worried about their spine, worried about injury, the back is the safest place to work. And so almost all of my classes start on the back, and that's because you can do hip mobility, you can do grounding stretches, you can do breath work, you can do core work, and it's safe and there's no pressure on wrists or knees. It's not going to work if you're doing a prenatal or you have someone in your class who's pregnant. You're going to need to figure that piece out. But if people aren't pregnant and they can lie down, it works really well for developing a safe but efficient, accessible yoga class. But because new trainees and teachers often start in other positions, they don't go onto the back until right before Shavasana. And so what happens is, I think it's just a convenience piece. They finally bring everyone down onto their back and they have X number of minutes left. So they teach a bunch of core work and then they go into Shavasana. But you've essentially really upregulated people right as you're asking them to downregulate. And so if you work them on their back at the beginning of class, you're not only safe, you're not only efficient, but you also get it out of the way. And that, I like to call that in sequencing, I call it the "it was all a dream" approach. Because by the time they get to Shavasana, they'll have forgotten that the hip and core mobility ever happened.
This is amazing. Some of the best classes I've ever been to started on their back. Like, I started on my back, let me be clear about that, as the student. And I love that you brought this in. Even my teaching has evolved where I do a lot of on the ground. That's what I love. I love that in my practice. I like to be really close to the ground. I've thrown out a lot. Like I had a shoulder injury where I stopped teaching any downward dog at all, just because I needed to do that in my own practice. And then I was looking for ways to get into the body in different ways. And then I, at times was like, that's it. I'm throwing out all sun salutations, all these And I think it's important to note that there are other ways to teach yoga. I recently taught a yoga class online. It's for a fundraiser. And one of the most common things that people said at the end was, "Oh my gosh, what style of yoga is that?" I thought, just like rolling around on the floor a lot yoga.
So funny you say that, because I consistently say that I teach advanced rolling around.
Oh my gosh, I love it. I love it so much. So that's a great one for our teachers to try. And it's a lot simpler than a very detailed, we're going to go through this whole flow on this side, standing, and then do this other side.
Oh, yeah. Oh my goodness. And you can start to get there's actually a lot of creativity to that. And I do think it's necessary if we're going to offer longer, more accessible classes. When, pre-pandemic, my Wednesday morning class, none of them will listen to it, but shout out to the Wednesday morning mamas and nanas. And there were papas there too. But as the teacher, I was bringing the average age in the room down to about 55. And it was a lot of retirees, and it was a 90-minute class. And it was hard to find people to substitute for me. because they had no idea how to do a 90-minute accessible class. It was just too long. And so that was always my advice was we don't even sit up until 30 minutes into class. And it's not just lying around, they're working. It's just they're working on their back or lying on their side. And then we make it up to seated. There's a lot of opportunity there.
There is. I feel like one of the best teachers of this and I'd love to hear who yours is, where I really soaked this up was Self-Awakening Yoga with Don Stapleton. And I'm pretty sure his book is still for sale. Don's not teaching now. He actually has Alzheimer's now. But I wonder, do you have any teachers or classes or styles that Vinny Yoga is another one that I feel like can be like that.
So in this particular regard, in this particular domain, no. I pretty much developed this as a response to be of service to the community I was teaching. I wrote the book with the inspiration that most people are teaching in communities where the population that can't downward dog as a resting pose or has a wrist injury or has a hip replacement, like that community is underserved. And so my teaching evolved by observation and communication, because I don't demonstrate a lot when I teach. I watch my classes. I do some demonstration, but I learn a tremendous amount from watching thousands of bodies move over the years. But I don't want to make that sound like I don't have teachers. I 100% have teachers who I love and respect. But my asana has been more of my own invention. But I will say that the inspiration, encouragement, and mentorship to see yoga as service comes from my two main teachers, Mona Warner being one of them. Mona wrote the foreword for the book, which, I cried about when she agreed to it, because she was also honest. And she said, I'm so glad you wrote a great book, because if you didn't, I couldn't write the foreword.
That's so good.
So my teacher, Mona, she is my teacher and friend and collaborator. And, I know that I'm lucky because I know that our relationship is unique. And then, my other teacher in a philosophical and service sense was Michael Stone. And Michael was also more interested in yoga asana that was adaptable and accessible and of service before he left us.
This is really great. I would encourage our listeners to just, do that. Get down on the floor, roll around. If you have a blanket and a slippery floor, like a hardwood floor or a kitchen floor, use your blanket, see all the things, the ways that you can move. This is great. This is really great to practice that exploring and get on the floor. And then you said there was another one as well. I forget what you had said.
So, as much as we love rolling around on the floor, and we do, my experimentation is hilarious looking, I'm sure. I still love what we might think of as classical yoga postures. The truth is that a lot of mobility exercises, especially those where you're putting kind of strong boundaries on the movement to target specific musculature, we can all be honest that you're not having a nuanced experience of prana as you're working on hip mobility. Like it's, you're in the material of your body. You're really working at a physical level. Whereas a lot of yoga postures actually allow you to settle sufficiently that you can have an experience of subtle energy. So I'm still a big fan of yoga postures. And the two that I often miss in new teachers' classes are significant back bends. it could be bridge pose. It could be what I call and Mona calls big back bend, which is essentially upward facing dog, except you just leave your legs on the ground and press yourself up. It could be seated variations, a couple of which I put in the book, but there is a tension release. There is an energetic shift to be had in big back bends, and there are accessible ways to approach them. But I almost always miss a big back bend in my teaching reviews. And then the other one is standing balance, because a lot of standing balance postures are not accessible, like dancer's pose, eagle, and we have lots of ways of making them more accessible. But in the book, I talk about what I call prerequisite mobility. So what needs to happen in the whole chain of joints to make this posture happen? And when it comes to standing balance, I always ask this question in my trainings, and it almost never occurs to people that the initial prerequisite mobility is to stand on one foot. And so there is value to helping people practice their balance. That could be as simple, like if you're teaching adaptive yoga to seniors with chair yoga, it can be as simple as a split stance, like literally one foot is in front of the other, still with space between them, and you have a chair in front of you. Anything that problematizes your balance helps you hone your balance. And so then if we're talking about classes where chairs aren't integrated, it's a tree pose where your foot is on the inside of your inner ankle rather than all the way up to your inner thigh. You just need to problematize balance. And I think because new teachers might have this end goal of a posture in mind, they forget the foundations of the posture. They just don't know the foundations of a posture. And so if you scale it and strip it all the way back to what the foundation is, there's a lot of value and good work to do there.
This is so good. From working in a physio office a lot with people who had traumatic brain injuries, balance was something that we worked on a lot. And then if you have students who are just rocking the balance, I like to use I call them a balance cushion, but it's a squishy cushion that's pretty low to the ground, or a balance disc. I don't know. I can try and include a link in case someone wants to see one. And if you throw that on the floor, it really will challenge your balance as well. So that's great. And I'm thinking, I have been taking back bends out of my own yoga practice. So I need to just, like, I do small bridges, but some of them, as you were saying this, I was thinking, that's one that goes off the list pretty quickly.
Yeah, there's, I put it in the book, but I'll just describe it now. There's a version of camel, which I actually learned from my mother like a decade ago. My mom is a yoga teacher. She was a yoga teacher long before I was. And my dad actually just came and co-led my latest silent retreat in October with me, because my dad is a Buddhist and meditator. So my parents are that's a little plug for my parents. My parents are super cool people. And my mom has, she started teaching yoga in her 30s, and now she's in her 60s. And so her practice has changed. And she showed me this version of camel where your knees are wide, and you're still sitting on your shins. So you're still kneeling, but your knees are wide, and you bring your hands on the ground behind you, and then lift your hips. So it's still not accessible for folks who can't reach the ground behind them. That remains true. But it's all the tension and load of the posture is much better distributed. And I actually find it's not one of those adaptations where you feel like you're losing something. It's just different. So both versions of camel are interesting. It's just different. I really love it.
I'm going to try that for sure.
Ooh, report back.
I will. I'd love to know also if our listeners have other variations of backbends or if they have anything else to add to this list. This list is a great start. Is there anything else that you think that you would tell the yoga teacher that's maybe new or feeling like, is there something missing from my class? Do you have any last bit to share with them?
Yeah. Again, I wrote this book and I offer this advice from the spirit of knowing folks want to do good work. And so, yes, I am offering trainings and the book in the spirit of refinement, because that is the practice of yoga. And be gentle with yourself. And remember that teaching yoga is so different than practicing yoga. So have faith in the practice. And if you have faith in the practice, you will settle into the teacher's seat and you will allow for silence and you will allow for figuring it out. You will allow people to have their journey because you can't do the work for them. You can only offer the space and the tools.
This is amazing. How can people find your book and how can they connect with you?
Yeah, all of my socials and my website is my name. It's Kathryn Anne Flynn, which is spelled a funny way. So I would probably click the show notes if I were you. And then my book, Teach Kind, Clear Yoga. If you're in Canada, it's available with Chapters Indigo. If you're in the UK, it's available through Waterstones. And then wherever there's an Amazon, there's a copy of my book.
All right. I'll make sure that we include all of that in the show notes. And did I see in your book, am I recognizing that Carly is in some of the photos in your book?
Yes, Carly Stong. Oh my goodness. Carly is lovely. She does some of the adaptive sun salutation modeling for me. Carly and I first met because I was her teaching assistant at Queen's University like a lifetime ago.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And then she also did her first training with Mona back in Kingston, Ontario. And yeah, so we are long time friends.
What a small world. I have not met Carly in person, but one day I will. We follow each other on Instagram and I follow what she's doing. This has been so cool to connect with you. Thank you so much for this very concrete list. It's, I think any yoga teacher can benefit from looking at this list. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh my goodness, connected yoga teachers. I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on today's episode? Thank you again, Kathryn. What an amazing list of things to think about and consider as we're sharing yoga, as we're creating these inclusive, accessible yoga spaces. Thank you for this conversation today. I love conversations where I just get to geek out about yoga. And I love that that's what we did last week on the podcast in episode 281. We did it this week, and we're actually going to continue on with this thread next week and talk to Francesca Cervero about how to get off of our mat a little more and not do the demos that we have been doing, and to be really engaged and watching our students more. So really picking apart, how do we start to teach without demos if we haven't practiced that before? This is something that we get asked about a lot. And it really continues on with this thread that we heard last week, this week, and going on. I'm excited that these 3 episodes fit together so nicely. Connected yoga teachers, let's continue this conversation for sure. The best place to do that is over in our show notes this week, because that gives you a chance to win Kathryn's amazing book, It's called Teach Kind, Clear Yoga. You might have already heard about it. It's a fantastic book. I'm grateful to Kathryn for sending me a copy so I could have a look at it before we recorded this podcast episode. And I'm really excited that one of you can win this book. So you just head on over to theconnectedyogateacher.com/282. Scroll down to the bottom under our show notes. You'll see a comment box there. Leave a comment. We'll do the draw for the book this Friday. So this works if you're listening in real time. Now, if you're listening, after this week when the podcast goes out and it is past July of 2022, that's okay. We can still continue the conversation in the Connected Yoga Teacher Facebook group if you want to, or you can still leave a comment on the show notes page, or send a voice message. That's over at theconnectedyogateacher.com. There's a button on the right-hand side. Yes, it will cut you off at 90 seconds, but just send another one. Say, okay, Shannon, this is part 2. And always let me know if this is a message just for me or if you want me to share it on the podcast. I would love to say thank you to Stacy Doucette for posting a message on our website. Stacy had left a message after we had done episode 268 with Nikki. That was the Yoga for Survivors of Sexual Assault that we did. And Stacy said, "Great podcast. This was a terrific interview with Nikki, who is an incredible yoga teacher with a true gift of intuition. It was very informative and I learned a lot. Thank you, OfferingTree, Shannon Crow, and Nikki Adams." Thank you so much, Stacy, for leaving this comment. By the way you wrote this comment, I kind of wonder if you know Nikki personally as a yoga teacher, or if you just really connected with her through this podcast episode. But I just want to say we appreciate your comment. We love each and every comment on podcast episodes. It inspires our entire team to keep doing the work that we're doing. Also, if you would like to hang out together, Connected Yoga Teachers, right now I don't have anything in person planned, but we do have some live calls and some live classes coming up, and that's all over inside of Pelvic Health Professionals. Now, if you think, well, is that for me? I would say to you, are you teaching to someone who has a pelvis? And do you feel like you understand the anatomy and the physiology of how the pelvis works in a human body? I was pretty surprised. I took anatomy in college. I had 3 babies. I learned about prenatal yoga and really specialized, and I still wasn't learning the details of how a pelvis works and how a pelvic floor works and all of the pelvic organs. And that is what inspired me to create Pelvic Health Professionals. So our live calls coming up, August, we're talking about desire and libido with Dr. Rose Schlaff. In September, we're talking about endometriosis and pelvic health with Jill Mueller, who is a pelvic health PT. And we also have a 6-week series, Yoga for Pelvic Health, that you can have access to. Everyone is invited to that, but if you join Pelvic Health Professionals, it's free for you. For everyone else, it's going to be $120. So this right there makes the membership worth it. Plus, you have access to all of our previous calls in there. So head on over to pelvichealthprofessionals.com to join, and we'll also put a link to that in our show notes. Also, I'll be here on Monday next week with Francesca Cervero. As I said, we're going to be talking about how to teach yoga without demos. Francesca gave so much in this interview. I cannot wait till you have a listen. And like I said, go back and listen to episode 281 if you haven't already. It will really inspire you along with today's episode and next week's episode. I just feel like, these 3 go together so well in helping us to prepare and get ready for that rush that comes in September. This is where people really want to sign up and get back to class and back to a routine. And I wanted you to have these episodes throughout the summer to get you ready. I also want to say a huge thank you for being here, for investing your time in your own yoga business, in looking at how you can become a better yoga teacher, That's really what today's episode and last week's are about. And also for the work that you're doing out in the world. I think that people lately have been dealing with a lot in the world. And our nervous systems and our bodies and our minds and our spirits really need a place where we can feel safe, where we can let the things of the day drop away, where we can come back into an awareness of our body and our mind. And you are giving that to people. So thank you so much for doing that work. Thank you for being here and hanging out for this whole episode all the way to the end. That means a lot. I also want to give a huge shout out of thank you to our team over here that helps make this possible. Suzanne, Crunch, and Sinead. These are 3 amazing people. I am very grateful that I get to work with them. Alrighty, as we're closing out today's episode, I would love to know, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?